Winter came that year like a long, low breath drawn by something ancient, settling over the frontier with the quiet intent of a creature preparing to sleep. Snow drifted across the wide plains in slow, deliberate sheets, soft as feathers yet heavy with omen, and the wind slipped between buildings as if it sought out lonely things. Chimneys exhaled thin spirals of smoke, rising into a sky the color of tarnished silver. Every sound felt muted. Boots in the snow, wagon wheels grinding frozen ruts, the creak of wooden signs straining in the cold. It was a morning that made even the strong tuck their chins deeper into scarves and hurry toward warmth. But one figure walked without a place to hurry to, carrying the weight of a winter no fire could soften. Ellery June Hart stepped off the porch of her late husband's brother with the stiff, trembling posture of someone trying not to collapse in full view of those who had just turned her away. Her carpetbag hung from one pale hand, the stitches on its side loosening like her last attempt at holding her life together. Behind her, the door closed with a decisive thud, not cruel in its sound but absolute, as though sealing her out of a world she had never been allowed to truly enter. She breathed once, deeply, letting her tears freeze before they could fall. She had learned not to cry where anyone could see. It gave people permission to say her sorrow was her own fault. She walked down the snow-packed road with small steps, the hem of her dress gathering frost, her boots soaked through. Above her, a crow watched from the edge of a roof, feathers puffed, head tilted as if it recognized the shape of a woman who had been discarded too often for reasons that were never her doing. Each breath left a ghost behind her. Each step felt like walking away from the last scrap of belonging she had hoped to keep. Near the edge of town, where the sheriff's office met the livery stable, a man stood chopping wood with unhurried strength. He was enormous, broad-shouldered, tall enough that even from a distance he seemed carved from the very mountains behind him. His copper-toned skin glowed warm against the cold air, and though winter bit at him, he remained shirtless, every muscle sculpted by a life that demanded constant resilience. Snow clung to his hair, long and tied back with a leather thong, and a faint sheen of sweat steamed from his skin. His name was Tawa Red Elk, and the townsfolk often spoke it with a mixture of wary respect and old prejudice. To some, he was a man who had survived too much. To others, he was simply too large, too quiet, too Apache to ever be trusted. When Ellery passed him, she kept her eyes down, though she could feel his gaze follow her. A gaze not sharp with judgment but heavy with recognition. He paused mid-swing, the axe resting against the block of wood, and in a small, almost imperceptible shift, he angled his stack of chopped logs to block the wind as she walked by. He did not speak. He did not step closer. Yet the gesture landed in her chest like a warm hand pressed against cold skin. Inside the seamstress's shop window, Martha Laywood watched with unabashed curiosity. Her voice, sharp as a quill pen scratching accusations into paper, carried through the glass even in winter. "Poor thing," she murmured. "Though trouble seems to cling to her like ashes. Mark my words, she won't last the week out here alone." Another woman nodded, sympathy painted over judgment. Ellery kept walking, pretending the wind drowned them out. She reached the church porch, half hoping for sanctuary, half hoping for silence. Reverend Olin Finch stepped out before she could sit, his breath fogging between them like a cold wall. "This porch isn't lodging," he said, voice gentle but unyielding. "Go on, child. Charity runs thin when winter runs long." "Yes, Reverend," Ellery whispered, though she had not asked for charity, only a place to rest her shaking legs. She walked on before he could say more, the rejection pressing into her ribs with practiced familiarity. She had lost her husband to a fever last season, but she had lost the place he left behind even faster. His family had made certain of that. By midday, the wind grew fiercer, tugging her hair loose, scattering what remained of her warmth. She drifted toward the outskirts, past the stable, past the frozen trough, past the line where civilization surrendered to wilderness. No plan guided her feet, only the instinct to keep moving, so the cold couldn't settle too deeply into her bones. Behind her, Tawa Red Elk watched again, the handle of his axe held loosely in one hand. He saw the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her fingers tightened on her bag until her knuckles whitened. He had seen people walk that way before, people who had run out of doors to knock on. Ellery stopped near a broken fence post, breath-trembling. The world felt unbearably wide. She whispered into the wind, "Where do I belong now?" The prairie swallowed her question without answer. From behind her came a long, steady crunch of footsteps in the snow. Not hurried. Not threatening. Just certain, like someone who knew the land well enough to trust its silence. Ellery turned slowly, unsure whether she wanted company or feared it. Tawa stood several paces away, the snow swirling around him like drifting smoke. For a moment, neither spoke. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, rising and fading. "You'll freeze out here," he said, voice low, shaped by a calm that felt older than either of them. Ellery swallowed, gripping her bag tighter. "I don't have anywhere else." He didn't move closer. Didn't offer false comfort. He simply nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth he had already seen etched in her steps. The wind gusted between them, carrying with it a kind of wordless understanding, a fragile thread suspended in winter's breath. And then, with the quiet resolve of someone who chose his moments carefully, Tawa Red Elk took one step forward, shifting the entire future with it. The wind curled around them like a restless spirit as Tawa Red Elk's single step carried its own gravity, a shift in the frozen air that Ellery June Hart felt across her skin. Snowflakes drifted onto his dark hair, melting the instant they touched the warmth rising from his body. He had the look of a man built from raw earth, anchored, enduring, but his eyes held something gentler, a depth that suggested he knew too well what it meant to be alone in a world sharpened by judgment. Ellery tightened her grip on her carpetbag, unsure if she stood before danger or deliverance. She had learned that help often came with chains, even when they were invisible at first glance. "You'll freeze," he repeated, voice low and even, almost carried away by the wind. "Storm's moving faster than it looks." Ellery nodded, though she couldn't force her feet to move. Pride tangled with fear, and fear tangled with the weary instinct to run from any offer that might leave her beholden. She had been used before. Kindness offered with one hand, while the other quietly took something from her. She looked at the rising wall of snow across the plains, then back at him. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured, the words cracking slightly. Tawa's gaze didn't waver. "A burden is someone unwanted. You're just cold." There was no flattery in the statement, no coaxing, no attempt to earn anything from her. It was simply true, spoken with a certainty that disarmed her more than tenderness would have. The silence stretched long enough that the wind began sweeping her footprints away, as though urging her to decide before it erased her path entirely. He lifted the coat folded over his arm, thick, fur-lined, worn by seasons, but didn't push it toward her. Instead, he set it gently on the broken fence beside her, the gesture quiet and respectful. Not offered to be refused. Simply placed near enough that she could choose. "You can warm yourself first," he said. "Then choose what comes next." Ellery stared at the coat, at the small kindness nestled into its folds. Her fingers twitched. Every instinct told her to take it. Her body shook so violently she feared her knees might give out, but her pride, fragile as it was, fought the idea of relying on anyone again. Through the seamstress's frosted windows behind them, two faces watched, sharp with suspicion. Martha Laywood pressed her palm to the glass, lips pursed with gleeful disapproval. "Look at that," she whispered to a companion. "Barely widowed and already seeking warmth wherever she can get it." Ellery heard the muffled gossip, the way cruelty could slip through glass as easily as through hearts. She stiffened, refusing the coat out of instinct, though her bones rattled. Tawa noticed. Not the gossipers, not her pride, but the slight way she leaned away from the fence, from the warmth, from anything that might be interpreted as need. His expression shifted. Not irritation, not pity, but a quiet understanding. He had lived with judgments far sharper than hers. Without another word, he stepped back, giving her space as though it were the most natural courtesy in the world. The wind roared between them, tugging at her hair, but something tethered them still. "How far is your home?" Ellery asked, barely audible. "Close," he said. "A few minutes if you follow. Less if you let me clear the path." "But people will talk." She hated how small the admission sounded. "People always talk," he replied. "Wind carries their words away faster than they can speak them." There was a softness in the way he said it, an invitation to ignore the world for one brief moment. Ellery exhaled, a slow release of breath she didn't know she'd been holding, then slipped her arms into the coat, hesitantly at first, then gratefully. Warmth surged across her shoulders, along her spine, down to her trembling fingers. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, Tawa had already turned, moving toward the trail that wound along the edge of town. His steps were steady, leaving deep impressions for her to follow. For a moment she hesitated, glancing back toward the town, toward the church, toward the house that had cast her out. But the snow was falling faster now, cloaking her past in white. She stepped forward. The world between buildings felt like a corridor of ice, but with every step she took behind Tawa, the cold seemed less like an enemy, and more like the edge of something new. His presence ahead of her carved a pocket of calm into the chaos, the way a tall pine shields the earth beneath it from the harshest winds. She realized he slowed his pace slightly, matching hers without drawing attention to it. By the time they reached the livery stable, the snow had thickened to a curtain. Tawa stopped by its side, turning to her with a look that carried neither assumption nor expectation. "You can shelter in the back of the stable," he said. "Out of sight. I'll bring blankets." Ellery's heart tightened. He had a home, yet he offered her the stable first. It was a courtesy she didn't immediately understand, until she realized he was giving her the option to choose safety without obligation. He wasn't assuming she wanted his cabin. He wasn't assuming anything at all. "I don't want to hide," she whispered. Tawa studied her face for a long moment. Snowflakes gathered along his eyelashes before melting into tiny beads. "Then come," he said simply. They walked into the wilderness side by side, the town receding behind them like a judgment closing its eyes. The wind softened beneath the pines, their trunks rising tall and ancient around them. Tawa led her to a small cabin nestled among the trees, smoke curling from its chimney in faint ribbons. Its wooden door bore scratches from years of weather, but a warm, amber glow flickered behind the window. He opened the door without ceremony and stepped aside. Heat washed over her in a comforting wave, the smell of burning cedar, dried herbs hanging from rafters, and something faintly sweet simmering in a pot near the fire. A handmade rug lay across the floor, woven in deep reds and browns. Ellery stepped inside slowly, each motion cautious, as though afraid she might shatter the warmth merely by touching it. Her breath fogged the air behind her like a lingering ghost before fading into nothing. Tawa set the door gently behind them. "You can warm yourself here," he said. "Stay until the storm passes." "I don't know how to repay you," she said, sinking onto a wooden stool by the fire. "You don't owe me anything." Her fingers curled into the hem of the coat. "People will think." "Let them think," he said quietly. "I don't bind my life to their thoughts." The words struck deep. She had tied her life to others' approval for so long that hearing someone dismiss it felt almost impossible to believe. He moved with a kind of careful solitude, taking bowls from a shelf, ladling warm stew without glancing at her too directly. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Ellery studied him through the flames, his steady hands, the slow rise and fall of his breath, the small scar across his left shoulder. A man shaped by hardship, but not hardened by it. When he set the bowl before her, he stepped back, giving her space again. "Why help me?" she asked. He paused. The flame light cast long, shifting shadows across his face. "Because winter is too cruel for one soul to face alone." The answer was simple, almost gentle. Yet something unspoken trembled beneath it, something she couldn't name. She held the warm bowl, feeling heat seep into her palms, grounding her. Somewhere outside, wind howled around the cabin's eaves, as though urging her to consider the truth she'd been avoiding. She had nowhere else, no one else, nothing left to lose except herself. And then Tawa said in a voice steady as the earth beneath them, "If you stay past the storm, there is more I should ask of you." The cabin's warmth wrapped around Ellery like a hesitant embrace, tender in its quietness, steady in its patience. She stood near the fire, the heat brushing her cheeks until the chill finally loosened its grip on her bones. Outside the storm deepened, wind clawing at the walls with restless hands, but within the single-room shelter, time moved differently, slower, softer, almost reverent. Tawa Red Elk moved with the unhurried certainty of someone accustomed to silence, his broad frame casting shadows that danced with the flickering flames. He carried a blanket toward her, but paused before handing it to her, as though ensuring she wanted the gesture before he completed it. She nodded, and he placed it gently around her shoulders, stepping back with the same quiet respect that marked every one of his movements. She sank onto the wooden stool again, clutching the warm bowl between her palms. The stew tasted richer now, the spices faint but comforting, the texture hearty enough to remind her that survival wasn't meant to be hollow. Tawa busied himself with simple chores, his motions purposeful yet calm, stirring the pot, straightening the tools by the hearth, adjusting the logs in the fire without once intruding on her space. Ellery watched him from beneath lowered lashes, not out of fear but fascination. There was a kind of steadiness about him she had never known, a stillness that felt earned through years of hardship, not inherited by ease. "You said there was something you might ask," she said finally, her voice trembling only slightly. "If I stayed beyond the storm." He stood at the table, hands resting on the edge as he considered her. The firelight gilded the curves of his muscles, highlighting scars that mapped a life she could only imagine. When he answered, his tone was low, not hesitant but deliberate. "Yes," he said. "But it shouldn't be spoken until you have warmth in your hands and strength in your breath." He gestured toward the stew, ensuring she continued to eat. The refusal to rush anything struck her deeply, as though he refused to place weight on someone still struggling to stand. Minutes passed with only the soft crackle of burning cedar between them. She let the warmth fill her, not just physically, but in some fragile part of her spirit she thought winter had swallowed whole. And when she finally breathed evenly again, when the trembling in her fingers faded, Tawa approached the stool across from her and lowered himself to sit. Even seated, he felt monumental, as though the room was built around him, not the other way around. "You came here with nothing," he said quietly. "But not because you deserved nothing." Ellery's throat tightened. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her, without accusation woven into their words. She nodded slowly, unsure how much he knew, how much the town had whispered. "They didn't want me," she said. "My husband's family. Not after he died. They said I was a burden, that I had no right to the home he left behind." "Grief makes people cruel," Tawa murmured. "Fear makes them worse." Ellery set her bowl aside, staring into the fire. "They said I was too much trouble. Too much need. Too much, everything." She hugged the blanket tighter around herself. "I got used to shrinking. To taking up as little space as possible." Tawa listened without interruption, his eyes steady, patient. "You don't shrink here," he said. "Not while the roof holds above us." She met his gaze for the first time without flinching, and something in her chest ached with relief so sharp it bordered on painful. Yet she noticed something in his eyes too, an echo of her own isolation, familiar in its quiet ache. "What about you?" she asked. "Why live so far from town? Do you shrink too?" His jaw tightened slightly, though not with anger. More with the heaviness of truth carried too long. "Some people prefer me distant," he said. "Others prefer me gone." He paused, letting the words settle. "I stay where I cause the least trouble. For them. For myself." Ellery shook her head. "You don't seem like trouble. Appearances don't matter out there." He nodded toward the storm-shrouded world beyond the window. "Fear teaches people to look at what's different and call it dangerous." The room fell into a contemplative hush. Outside, the wind beat against the cabin with increasing fury, but inside, the air felt warmer, threaded with shared understanding, with the tender recognition of two wanderers who had been pushed to the edges of the same harsh world. When Ellery finally spoke again, her voice felt steadier. "You said you might ask something of me. What is it?" He inhaled slowly, the kind of breath taken before a truth that cannot be unspoken. "If you stay beyond the storm," he said, "I will need more than a guest. This home, this life, is not meant to be lived alone. But I would not ask anything without offering the same in return." Understanding dawned slowly, like the first ember in a fire pit. Her pulse quickened, not with fear but with the fragile sensation of stepping near a cliff whose edge she could not yet see. "You mean, companionship?" "Not forced," he said immediately. "Not bound by anything except choice. But yes, a bond. A life shared. Survival together rather than apart." Ellery's heart thudded unevenly. The world had offered her proposals before, quietly cruel ones wrapped in expectation. But nothing about Tawa felt like a trap. His words invited rather than claimed, offered rather than demanded. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "I don't even know who I am without fear." "You can learn," he said softly. "No one is born knowing how to be unafraid. But warmth teaches. Safety teaches. Time teaches." She lowered her gaze, letting the fire blur into gold and amber. A part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the steadiness he held. But another part, smaller yet stubborn, clung to the memory of every betrayal she'd endured. "What if people talk?" she asked. "They will," he answered. "But they don't speak for you. Or for me." The simplicity of the statement struck her harder than the winter wind ever could. She wrapped her fingers around the blanket's edge until the wool bit into her skin, grounding her. The storm raged louder, as though marking a turning point neither of them could ignore. And as the wind wailed against the cabin, Tawa leaned forward just enough that the firelight caught the sincerity etched into his features. "Ellery," he said, her name a quiet vow in the warm space between them. "You don't have to decide tonight. But before this storm ends, you must choose whether to walk back into the cold." His gaze held hers, unflinching. "Or stay in the warmth you deserve." The storm arrived in the deep hours of night, not with thunder or spectacle, but with a heavy, suffocating whiteness that pressed against the cabin walls, as though the world itself were trying to crawl inside. Snow fell in relentless sheets, driven sideways by a wind that screamed across the plains with a voice too old to belong to anything human. Ellery awoke to the sound of it, a hollow, keening wail that rattled the shutters and sent a shiver through the beams overhead. For a moment she forgot where she was, her mind reaching instinctively for the familiar dread of her husband's family house, until the warm glow of the hearth pulled her back into the present. She sat slowly, pulling the blanket tighter, letting her eyes adjust to the soft amber light flickering across Tawa's carvings and the rugged lines of the walls around her. Tawa stood near the window, motionless as carved stone, his profile outlined by the storm's pale fury. He glanced back when he sensed her awake. The look in his eyes wasn't fear, nothing in him seemed to tremble, but there was a heaviness, a quiet calculation, as though he was measuring the storm's intent. "The drifts are rising fast," he murmured. "By dawn, the path back to town will be gone." Ellery swallowed, glancing toward the door as though imagining herself pushing into that blinding world. The thought alone chilled her more than the wind. She sensed what he wasn't saying. The storm had made her choice feel closer, more real, more urgent. The hours that followed unfolded in slow, breath-filled intervals. Tawa moved with deliberate grace, securing the shutters, feeding the fire, setting extra logs within reach. Ellery helped where she could, though her hands shook with cold that hadn't quite left her bones. She lit candles, folded blankets, arranged the dried herbs on the shelf. Each small task felt strangely intimate, as though the cabin was learning her presence, adjusting to her shape. And yet the weight of Tawa's earlier words lingered between them, a quiet thread tying warmth to decision, shelter to the fragile question of belonging. When the fire burned low, Tawa motioned her closer. "Sit," he said softly, placing a steaming mug of root tea in her hands. "You're still cold." She took it gratefully, the heat seeping into her palms, loosening the tight ache in her chest. But warmth couldn't dissolve the thoughts swirling inside her. "Tawa," she whispered, "why would you want someone like me? I come with nothing but trouble." He sat across from her, his expression unreadable but steady, grounding her. "You come with life," he replied. "With hope, even when you don't see it. That is not trouble." The simplicity of the statement struck her more deeply than she expected. Later, when she stepped outside to gather a bucket of snow for melting, the storm's teeth sank straight into her skin. The cold punched the breath from her lungs, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She took 3 steps and her legs buckled. The world tilted, snow swallowing her vision. She heard Tawa's voice faint through the storm before she felt his arms lift her, carrying her like a fallen branch shielded from the wind. Back inside, he wrapped her in blankets, rubbing her arms gently, but firmly until feeling returned. His worry wasn't loud, it was etched in every careful movement, every deep breath he steadied against her trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered when she finally met his eyes. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." His gaze held hers with a quiet intensity. "You are not trouble," he repeated. "You forget your worth because others taught you lies." Her eyes burned as she looked away. Shame had been stitched into her since girlhood. Quiet barbs from her late husband, sharper ones from his family, all of them convincing her she held no value except what others gave her. Now, faced with a man who offered shelter without condition, she felt that old shame tighten its grip, whispering she was unworthy of such gentleness. The storm worsened by midday, its howl deepening into something that made the cabin tremble. A sudden pounding rattled the door, 3 sharp, urgent blows. Ellery flinched, startled. Tawa rose instantly, hand resting on the latch but not opening it yet. "Who is it?" he called. A voice answered, half muffled by wind, yet unmistakably forceful. "Reverend Finch." "Open the door, Tawa." Ellery's stomach twisted. She knew why he'd come. The Reverend stepped inside without waiting for welcome. Snow clinging to his coat, disapproval etched deeply into his stern features. His gaze swept the room, landing on Ellery wrapped in her blanket beside the fire. "This is no place for a young widow," he declared. Ellery straightened, though her heart hammered. "I came here for shelter," she said quietly. "From the storm." The Reverend shook his head. "A woman in your position must be mindful of appearances. Townsfolk are already speaking." Tawa stepped between them, not threatening, but firm in his presence. "She is safe here," he said. "No harm comes to her." Reverend Finch's eyes narrowed. "Safety is not the concern. Reputation is. A widow living under an unmarried man's roof, especially one of your—" His voice faltered, but the meaning landed like a blow. Ellery felt the sting of it more than she expected. Tawa's jaw tightened. "You speak of reputation," he said, while leaving her to freeze outside. "Is this the morality you preach?" The Reverend bristled. "She cannot stay. She must come with me." Ellery felt her breath quicken. The room seemed to tilt, the firelight flickering in frantic shadows. Every instinct screamed that she could not follow him. Not back to the judgmental eyes of town, not back to the cold rooms that saw her as burden rather than human. Yet years of conditioning told her she should obey, that resisting would only draw more scorn. Tawa turned to her, his expression softening. "You choose," he said quietly. "Not him. Not me. You." Ellery's throat closed around a rush of emotion. No one had given her the power of choice before. Not once. She looked at her hands trembling in the blanket, then at the Reverend's impatient glare, then at Tawa's patient, steady presence, solid as the earth beneath her feet. The storm roared outside, beating the door like an angry drum. Inside, silence stretched until Ellery felt something in her chest shift, something long chain begin to crack. She stood slowly, legs unsteady but resolve building with each breath. "Reverend," she said, voice shaking but clear, "I won't return with you." His face darkened. "Child, you don't understand the consequences." "I do," she interrupted softly. "But I choose to stay where I am treated with gentleness." The Reverend stared at her as though she'd spoken blasphemy. "This is madness," he hissed. "You'll destroy your reputation." She met his gaze with newfound steadiness. "There's not much left to destroy." The Reverend's anger flickered into something like disbelief before he turned sharply toward the door. "Very well. You've sealed your fate." He left without another word, snow swallowing him as quickly as it had arrived. Ellery sank back to the stool, breath shaky but filled with a strange, warming certainty. Tawa knelt beside her, not touching, simply grounding her with his quiet presence. The storm howled on, but within the cabin, something had shifted. Something fragile and brave and impossibly new. And in the trembling glow of firelight, as Ellery lifted her eyes to Tawa's, she felt the full weight of the choice she had made, just as the distant echo of approaching voices broke through the storm, signaling that the town's judgment was far from finished. Dawn broke slowly over the storm-scoured plains, washing the world in pale gold, as if the sun itself wished to apologize for the night's cruelty. Inside Tawa's cabin, the fire smoldered in soft embers, casting thin ribbons of warmth across the wooden floor. Ellery woke to the hush of morning, her breath steady, her heart still echoing with the courage she'd found against the Reverend's judgment. She felt different, not entirely safe, not entirely certain, but undeniably changed, like a branch bending under snow that somehow refused to break. Outside, boots crunched over the hardened drifts, slow and heavy. Tawa stiffened, listening. Ellery rose, her fingers curling around the blanket's edge. The voices approached, low, angry, uncertain. When the door rattled, Tawa placed himself between Ellery and whatever waited outside. Sheriff Cutter's voice cut through the cold. "Tawa? Open up. We need to talk." Tawa cracked the door and stepped outside, the gust of frigid air swirling around him. Ellery hovered near the hearth, listening, pulse quick. The sheriff's tone carried urgency, not hostility. "There's a group of ranch hands riled up," Cutter warned. "They mean to save the widow from you. Stupid talk, but they're headed this way with torches." Ellery's heart lurched. She stepped toward the doorway, calling through the gap. "This is my choice." Her voice trembled but held. Cutter nodded, eyes softening. "Then you'll need to stand in it." Tawa returned inside, closing the door against the rising wind. He met her gaze, calm but unyielding. "You're not in danger as long as I'm here." She swallowed. "I don't want you hurt because of me." His expression softened, almost unbearably. "I have lived many winters alone. This is the first worth fighting for." The words warmed her more than any fire. Yet the pounding of hooves shattered the fragile quiet. Shadows moved outside, torches flickering like knives of flame against the snow. Ellery felt her fear tighten, but something deeper rose with it, resolve. Tawa stepped outside first, towering like a sentinel carved from stone. Ellery, breath shaking, followed him, refusing to hide. The ranch hands halted, their faces twisted with suspicion and self-righteous intent. "We ain't lettin' a widow get claimed by some wild savage," one snarled. Ellery stepped forward, surprising even herself. "I am not claimed," she said. "I am sheltered. And I stand where I choose." Murmurs rippled through the men. But before their anger could ignite, Sheriff Cutter arrived with 2 deputies, dismounting with urgency. "Enough!" Cutter barked. "Go home before you burn down half the territory for the sake of your pride." The men, unsure, finally scattered, muttering into the storm, their torches snuffed out. Cutter looked at Ellery with a gravity that held no judgment. "If this is where you choose to be," he said, "then we'll honor it." When the lawman left, the silence that settled felt different. Not fearful, not fragile, but clearing, like a sky ready for dawn. Inside again, Ellery shed the blanket, her trembling eased. She faced Tawa, the fire's glow warming the space between them. "They think I'm weak," she said. "But I never felt stronger than when I stood beside you." His breath deepened. Because strength grows where a heart is finally allowed to rest. She stepped closer, feeling the pull of something warm and terrifying. Her voice softened. "Your offer, does it still stand?" Tawa's expression shifted, a mixture of reverence and relief. He nodded. "Only if it's your choice." Ellery reached into her pocket, pulling out her wedding band. The metal glinted weakly, a remnant of a life built on silence and shrinking. She set it on the windowsill, letting the dawn light claim it. "Then I choose this," she whispered. "I choose you. I choose the home we could build." Tawa stepped toward her, lowering his forehead to hers. The gesture was soft, ancient, binding. She felt his breath, warm as promised spring. "Then we build it together," he murmured. Outside, the storm began to ease, flakes drifting instead of striking. The world, so recently violent, seemed to exhale. And as the first true light touched the snow, Ellery turned toward Tawa, feeling something inside her finally unthaw, opening like a stubborn bud that had waited far too many winters to bloom. But then a distant horn echoed across the valley, sharp and unfamiliar, a sound rolling over the snowfields like a shiver carried on wind, hollow and purposeful, making the air between them tighten. Ellery's breath caught, her fingers curling into Tawa's sleeve instinctively. "What is that?" she whispered. Tawa listened, every muscle drawn taut, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the frosted window. "Not ranch hands," he said. "Not townsfolk." The horn sounded again, closer, clearer, echoing off the distant pines like a warning carved from bone. Ellery felt the fragile warmth inside her brace against the new uncertainty. "Then who?" Tawa's silence became its own answer. He stepped away just long enough to take his bow from the wall, stringing it with practiced ease. Yet when he turned back to Ellery, there was no fear in his expression, only the steady, unwavering resolve of a man who had endured storms far worse than winter. "Whatever comes," he said, voice low, "we face it as we stand now." The words threaded through Ellery's chest, anchoring her like roots gripping thawing earth. She nodded, stepping beside him, her fear no longer shrinking her but sharpening her with purpose. Another horn blast tore across the valley, followed by distant silhouettes emerging through the snow, riders approaching in a slow formation that made the air vibrate with intent. Ellery's heart pounded, but she did not step back. Instead, she slipped her hand into Tawa's, grounding herself in the warmth of the choice she'd made. He squeezed gently, a silent vow forming in the space between them. The riders drew nearer, close.